We lived in a quiet neighborhood where power cuts were just a regular part of summer. Almost every night around 9, the electricity would cut out, the ceiling fan would grind to a dead stop, and the room would start trapping heat. By midnight, it was impossible to sleep. You'd just lie there in the dark, sweating onto the sheet, waiting for a breeze that never came. My mother spent years telling me to keep the wooden window shutters bolted shut at night. She had a whole list of reasons: stray animals, thieves, bad luck, spirits. But our flat was on the first floor, a good 12 feet above the concrete alleyway. Nobody was scaling a bare brick wall in the dark just to steal a cheap desk lamp or a phone. So every night, as soon as the ceiling fan died, I pushed the heavy wooden frames wide open. The faint night breeze off the street was the only thing that made sleeping possible. About 100 yards behind our plot sat an old brick well. It went dry long before my family moved there. Abandoned to wild weeds, ivy, and heavy wooden planks laid across the opening to keep people from falling in. As kids, my friends and I used to drag those planks aside just enough to peer down into it. It was pitch black down there, just a deep shaft of dead air and cold stone. If you dropped a stone, you wouldn't hear a splash. You would just hear a quiet thud seconds later, buried in soft sludge. There was always a local rumor attached to the place. The older neighborhood kids claimed something lived at the bottom, something that crawled in during a heavy monsoon flood years ago and never came back up. I never believed it. To me, it was just an ugly pit of stagnant earth and old rubbish. There was one afternoon, though, that I couldn't get out of my head once things started going wrong. I was 14, hanging around the well with my friend John. John was usually the calmest guy in our group, the type who never got rattled by stupid ghost stories. I was kicking around an old canvas sneaker, a beat-up shoe I had worn for 2 summers straight until the sole blew out. On a whim, I picked it up and dropped it straight through the gap in the wooden cover. We waited. 3 seconds passed, then 4. A quiet, soft thump echoed up from the mud below. I turned around, expecting John to laugh, but his face was completely pale. "What the hell did you do that for?" he asked, his voice tight. "It's just an old shoe," I said, laughing it off. "We throw stones down there all the time." "A stone isn't yours," John said, staring at the black gap in the planks. He wasn't yelling, he was deadly quiet, which made it worse. "A stone doesn't belong to anyone, but a shoe carries your sweat, it carries your scent. You don't offer things that belong to you to a place like that." I told him he was being stupid, but he wouldn't look at the well for the rest of the day. Eventually, years passed and I forgot all about it until this summer. It started with small things. I began waking up to tiny wet spots on the floorboards near the edge of my bed. At first, I dismissed it entirely. I assumed I was spilling water from my bedside glass while stumbling back from the bathroom half asleep in the dark. Then came the morning I found my phone sitting on the bedside table, its screen covered in heavy drops of clear water. The room was dry everywhere else. There were no leaks from the ceiling, no open bottles, and the weather had been completely dry for weeks. 2 days later, I stepped out of bed and felt something cool and slick under my heel. I looked down. Right on the floorboards beneath the open window was a small, smeared patch of murky brown water. Fine grit and silt sat at the bottom of the puddle, leaving a dirty ring against the wood. I checked my feet, but they were clean. I looked at the ceiling next, expecting a leaking pipe, but it was bone dry. The mud on the floorboards was fresh and cold right beneath the open window. Something dripping wet had stood there in the dark while I was asleep. I decided to stay awake the next night. The power went out right on schedule around 2 in the morning. The fan hummed to a stop, and the room plunged into total darkness. I lay flat on my back, eyes open, staring up at the shadow of the ceiling, waiting. An hour passed. Then the air in the room changed. The temperature dropped instantly, brought in with a thick smell of stagnant pond water, wet silt, and decaying leaves. My entire body locked up. I lowered my eyelids until they were barely open, keeping my breathing as shallow and even as I could. A soft, wet squelch hit the bare floorboards right next to my bed. Illuminated only by the weak moonlight from the open window, I saw it. It was impossibly thin. Its ribs pushed sharp against pale gray skin, stretched tight over a skeletal frame like it had been starving for decades. Long, matted strands of dark hair hung down its back, dripping wet, heavy drops slapping against its hips and the floor. It was completely bare, coated in a slick layer of river mud. It didn't move with rage or violence. It moved slowly, almost awkwardly, leaning down until its face was barely 6 inches from mine. I kept my eyes nearly closed, terrified that a single twitch would give me away. In the dim light, I could see its face. Its eyes were wide, milky, and completely unblinking. It stared down at me with a terrifying, childlike curiosity. Slowly, it raised a long arm. Its thin fingers reached out and gently touched my bare forearm. The skin felt freezing, far too cold for any living human being. The touch was light, almost a stroke, as if it was verifying that I was real. A second later, it pulled its hand back, turned silently toward the open window, and climbed back out into the dark. I didn't sleep a single second for the rest of the night. I lay there paralyzed, listening to every creak of the house until the sun came up. As soon as there was enough light outside, I walked out of the house and straight to the old well. I stopped dead in my track. Sitting neatly on top of the rotting wooden planks, completely dry, was my old canvas sneaker, the one I had thrown down the shaft years ago. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. I carried it to the clear patch of dirt behind our boundary wall, poured a small bottle of lighter fluid over it, and struck a match. I washed in silence until the shoe burned down to gray ash, then swept every last speck into an old plastic tub and dumped it into a trash bin down the street. When I turned around, John was standing near the alley corner, watching me silently. I hadn't heard him approach. I jumped, shocked to see him there so early. "John, what are you doing here?" He looked at the empty spot where the shoe had been burned, then looked back at my face. His eyes were heavy, with dark circles underneath them. "You saw it?" he said softly. It wasn't a question. A chill ran down my spine. How did you know?" John stared at the ground for a long moment before looking up at me. "A few years ago, I threw a dirty gym sock down there for fun," he said, his voice flat and empty. "A week later, I started finding wet marks on my bedroom windowsill." He paused, swallowing hard. "I live on the third floor,"